Apocryphal, Book 1, Pariah. Prologue. Thael stood alone in the small courtyard, shivering against a chill that emanated not from the late autumn breeze, but the rime-encrusted center of the hollowed-out pit that was, until a turn of the glass ago, his own heart. The darkness around him, nearly complete save for the faint glimmer of the twin moons dancing high above their veil of clouds, seemed a perfect outward manifestation of his own tortured thoughts. He pulled his hood closer about his face and stared downward, unable to see the coal-hued flagstones at his feet. All was black, shadow, saturnine. And yet, when he considered the darkness which surrounded and enfolded him and weighed it all against his own humor, everything seemed positively aglow. The intricate wrought-iron lamps set around the fountain at the center of the gardens in which he stood were cold and lightless. Few of the estate's inhabitants were awake at this hour, but anyone who happened to glance through any of the silver-framed windows overlooking this little cloister would easily dismiss his darkened form as only a vague shadow against many others. Despite this, Thael felt as though the eyes of the world were upon him. In reality, the only eyes that looked his way were those of 3 sneering gargoyles that glared in judgment at him from high atop the marble column at the center of the courtyard. He could not see them, but he could hear the trickle of water that poured forth from each toothy maw to run down the smooth, polished surface of the marble statue upon which they stood. Their liquid sentence ran its course along the green marble folds and ridges of this stone representation of the very goddess he served, from the palms of the hands that held the capital high above, down her arms, across her eyes, to run as a torrent of tears down her tall form into the rippling bowl of the fountain's granite base. Its sound was a tormenting chorus of accusation and damnation. Thael shook his head and silenced the voices through sheer force of will. They were imagined whispers, nothing more, and had no place here. This garden was his sanctuary, a shrine to his faith. He had always found comfort enough here to examine his thoughts in meditation. This was the one place in the whole of the Lorenian Reach where he could find peace enough to hear his goddess, however rarely she chose to speak. He took a deep breath and rolled his shoulders, willing his mind to clear. "The water will cleanse your mind of confusion," came the whisper from his memory. Each word tore a piece from his heart. "You should place the fountain in the center here, and in the spring we can plant roses round about the edge." Brenna. Thael felt the chill within him deepen and spread along his spine as the name escaped his lips. Any trace of comfort he felt was instantly banished by anguish. His heart could have very well stopped beating in that moment, and he would have gladly hurled himself headlong into the blackest depths of the void to escape the misery left in the wake of this night's events. Though he firmly believed all honest business was best conducted in the full light of day, he silently intoned a prayer of thanks to Vindra for the darkness around him. There were too many reminders here, too much of Brenna's touch, and hence her psychic imprint, lingering on every surface of this courtyard. She had helped him design it, even secretly commissioned a sculptor to cast the gargoyles above him and the sundial that stood somewhere to his left. He could feel the echoes of her love radiating from the entire garden. They crashed across the sullen, stony shores of his mind, like waves running before a sea tempest. The statue, the fountain, the braziers and lanterns, the very stones upon which he tread, reverberated the psychic song of Brenna Tolnarene. Were he to look upon his surroundings now, he would surely go mad with grief. He found himself remembering every word she had ever spoken to him, every gasp he had ever drawn from her during their surreptitious interludes, every smile with which she had blessed him on every happy occasion. Her face seemed to materialize from the darkness. Enough of this. He set his jaw and stared straight ahead into the unblinking night. All expression faded from his face as he struggled to suppress the memories, to silence the voice of the woman who should have been his wife before it drove him insane. A few breaths, and his body became motionless, save for the slow rise and fall of his chest. A few more, and he had managed to seal away his mind behind a wall of mental wards so thick that not even the background hum of the terrines around him could be detected. His heart, however, was a furious bedlam of frustration and confused rage, emotions he had not felt in decades. They were old friends, demons which once ruled his very being. Were it not for the will, he would have long since succumbed to their violent charms. Will. It was the single most important aspect of his existence. Hardened by years of rough discipline under the watchful tutelage of even rougher men, Thael's will had granted him levels of power and expertise he never thought possible. The ordeal, as it was called by the masters of the Vindran Order, had instilled within him focus, control, purpose, all critical traits for the unruly young man who had long ago set out to break the bonds of the Terrene and become something so much more. But the powers granted by the will were not without cost. Memories of the start of his life's journey paraded before his mind's eye and evoked a longing for the boy he had once been. Optimistic, hopeful, naive. The life of a wielder had quickly destroyed these aspects of his soul. Campaign after campaign had reshaped him in the white-hot forge of war, tempered his will in the spouting blood of his enemies, tested his mettle and resolve time and again, and each time he had emerged bloody, battered, but victorious. The Guardians eventually took notice of his valor and faith, and they told him of a duty more sacred and challenging than all others. He accepted, and everything in his life changed. The training did not cease, nor did the campaigning. But by the goddess, those men had grossly understated the truth. None of their words could have prepared him, or any young wielder, for life as a keeper. It was during his training as an elite keeper of the writ that he was introduced to Brina Tolnarane. They had met what seemed to be a lifetime ago, while he was still in service of, and essentially slave to, the ruthless and unyielding guardian Ekran Toltir. Ekran, a proud and often haughty descendant of the foremost Thorn, had been Thael's teacher in the final years of his tutelage in the ways of guardianship. He had been a brutal, unforgiving master who inspired fear equally among his enemies and allies, but he had also been almost inhumanly efficient at his assigned duties. A bloodline marked for culling held no hope of survival once Guardian Ekran Toltir caught their scent. He was merciless, absolutely uncompromising, even bloodthirsty in his pursuit. He was also the uncle of one of the most talented wielders Thael had ever met. Brina Tolnarane, an orphaned member of Clan Tull and refugee from the First Talandarian War, had been discovered by the stewards of House Thornreaver at the age of 15. She had survived their not-so-tender ministrations and was selected, as was Thael, for training as a keeper of the writ. This placed them both under the direct command of a guardian, with the potential for promotion to a guardianship of their own. Brina had arrived at Ekran's estate in Blackshore a few weeks ahead of Thael, and from the outset the two of them had butted heads like a pair of angry bulls. They were equally naive, exuberant, and willing to please. They were also equally ambitious and calculating. Not long after Ekran revealed to them the true duty of a keeper, Brina had, despite her amazing talent and drive, proven unwilling to perform that duty without emotion. She faltered. Thael felt sure that Ekran, who never suffered a keeper's failure lightly, would fly into a rage, but the old man had simply taken Brina aside, spoken quietly and consolingly to her, and kissed her gently on the forehead. He then ordered her immediate expulsion from the estate, and posted her as a wielder in service to a maddeningly quiet backwater county on the coast of the Stone Sea, far to the southeast. She was gone before Thael could even wish her well, and though their parting was cavalier on the surface, Thael had felt as if his thumb had been amputated from that day forward. He managed to persevere, and after hard years of service and an incredibly difficult and bloody campaign that resulted in Ekran's death, Thael Irilam had finally been appointed his own guardianship. The Order, impressed as they were with his victory over the seditious element eating them from within, had not only offered him his choice of jurisdiction, as tradition demanded, they had also offered him Ekran's estate. He was sorely tempted to take over Ekran's post. The old guardian had spent decades building a formidable force of wielders and keepers, and his treasury was only outmatched by that of the Order Conventicle in Telverth. Then there was the matter of real estate. Ekran's lands were easily 3 times as large as his own holdings in the Green Cape, and the rich, deep lowlands Blackshore soil ensured his crop yields would be more than adequate to sustain an even larger force, should he wish to build one. This would, of course, have forced him to pay a much larger sum of tribute and taxes to the crown in Telfirth. The matter of handling the day-to-day logistical and administrative demands of two large estates separated by almost 500 leagues of dense forest, nigh impassable mountains, volcanic wasteland, and festering swamp did not appeal to him in the slightest. The deciding factor, however, was the campaign that had earned him his promotion. The memories of the bloodshed, the monstrous, unbelievable betrayal, and Ekron's gory, horrifying, screaming death were all far too fresh in his mind. He instead elected to return to his homeland in the Green Cape on the northern edge of the river plains. It was smaller, more familiar, and, to Thael's own mind, more in keeping with his own station as a newly frocked guardian. Let some bureaucrat or arse-licking toady from another sept take over Ekron's responsibilities. Thael wanted, more than anything he had ever wanted, to simply go home. He had, however, been in dire need of competent wielders to build his staff, and remembered Brenna as among the best with whom he had thus far trained. He used his newfound influence with the Order to locate Brenna, then added a full 3 weeks to his journey home in order to recruit her to his service. Her initial reaction was outright anger. She had sincerely thought he had come to torment her with news of his success. After Thael told her of Ekron's fate, she accused him of seeking absolution by protecting her. Several days were spent convincing Brenna that he only sought her talents as a wielder. She was skeptical of the idea, but eventually relented after some very shrewd negotiation of the conditions of her room and board. From the day she accepted his offer, Thael's fondness of Brenna grew. His original intent was to simply bring her into the fold and make use of her talents as a thorn reaver. Over the months to follow, her brilliance and ambition had driven him to appoint her his senior lieutenant. As time passed, he discovered that she possessed a mischievous wit and charm that rivaled her heartbreaking beauty. These traits were bolstered by a depth of faith and strength of conviction the likes of which Thael had never seen, and all of this, the very essence of Brenna, had drawn him to love her as he had never loved another human being. They had likewise driven him away from the emotionless thing that called herself his wife. His marriage to Pariah, which took place before either of them had reached the age of 20, had been a purely political maneuver, nothing more. There was no love involved. It was an arrangement made by two influential and powerful families with the intention of gaining even more influence and power. At the time, Thael had thought it perfect, as he was rarely home and had no desire to become emotionally invested in anyone. Then, Brenna had come along, and... "Stop this. Wounds are to be staunched, not held open to bleed." But this was no ordinary wound to be healed by an apothecary's salves and dressings, nor was it a psychic wound to be healed by time and meditation. This was a wound to his very soul, one through which he could feel the essence of his existence pouring out like the dark blue heart's blood of a boar held fast on a huntsman's cruel spear. Not even a cautery could stop this flow. The will. Focus. Breathe. He once again forced his mind to blank. He focused. Clarity came to him again, and with it, thoughts of the present, and how this cursed night would come to affect his future. He set aside his emotions. Logic was the key, he knew. He turned inward. He assessed. He was a guardian of the Thorn Reaver Sept. As such, he was an example to all wielders in his charge. This placed upon him the yoke of leadership, the heaviest burden he had yet borne. His many obligations to his own keepers did not end with the death of his mistress. This was a perfect example of the most important lesson every wielder of the will faced. Sacrifice. Sacrifice, loss, and tribulation were at the very core of every wielder's life. Every man and woman beneath him had long since given up any hope for peace to serve him. But he would not, nay, could not, allow himself to pity them. Any aspirant who survived the ordeal knew full well what their life would be when they earned their place in a sept. There would be no time for the trivialities of emotion and attachment, certainly no place. They would marry, yes, but not out of love or devotion. They would do so to continue their bloodlines, as their sacred duty commanded, knowing all the while that they would only rarely be allowed to spend time with their children. Their duty was to the Order, men and women alike, and the Order never slept. Every aspiring wielder knew these things, and still they swore their oaths. "A fool were you to fall in love, Thael," he thought, as memories of his life whirled behind his eyes. "You broke the most basic of the tenets. Your pain is earned, and well-deserved." This was truth in its most brutal form. His station afforded him no room for emotion. He was a guardian, a protector of the Order. His duties required impartiality and logic, neither of which were compatible with emotion of any kind. Emotion clouded a guardian's judgment, and judgment was the purpose of his life. His fists clenched as infuriating reality truly settled into his mind. "This is my judgment. My love for Brenna brought this damnation upon me." The experience gained from a lifetime of service to the Order assured him that this was indeed true, and yet he could not accept it. Anger flared, and he twitched. His breath came in short, jerky gasps. How could Vindra have forsaken him so cruelly? His entire life was dedicated to enforcing the laws of the Order and protecting her word. He was one of the few guardians who had not given in to vice and corruption. He was a pious man, faithful to the Order and his sept, and would suffer his subordinates to be nothing but the same. He was a protector of the people, a scourge of the void, a man of courage, a man of honor, and this simple transgression, the sin of love, had brought such terrible pain and wrath upon him. The anger was growing, billowing outward in clouds that obscured reason and thought. His body trembled as the crushing psychic echoes of Brenna's presence crashed against the walls around his mind, and his heart screamed for action, anything but this imprisoning stillness. He lowered his head and forced himself to breathe slowly and evenly. He forced the blood-boiling rage downward, mentally wrestling his emotions to the floor of his soul as he recited a single line from the orisons of will in a ragged whisper. "As it is willed, so shall it be. As it is willed, so shall it be." This eventually settled his mind and allowed him to regain some modicum of composure, but he could not ignore the ball of lead in his gut, the burning in his chest. His mouth was dry, his skin felt cold, and he was still trembling. "Something must be done," he thought. "I cannot lose them both." The deep shadows surrounding the courtyard seemed to deepen further. The chill Thael felt in his heart grew colder still, as a sickeningly familiar presence crept into the edge of his roiling consciousness. The touching of minds was nothing new to him, but this one. "Your summons has been answered, Guardian." Thael reeled, his confusion and anger momentarily forgotten, as an unbelievable power came to bear on his mind. The will of this wretch, already immeasurable in scope, had only grown in the 10 years since their last encounter. Thael did not move. He steeled his mind shields and responded, careful to keep the simmering anger and confused emotions hidden. "You travel quickly," he sent. The reply came, this time with much less force. "Your mind is awash, Thael. What has befallen you?" Thael sighed. "Brenna is dead." The energies between their minds swirled. Thael did not need to see his guest to know that he was cringing. "I weep for you, Thael." "Weep for my son, if you must, for he is twice cursed. He has lost his mother, and carries the mark of Anok." The mind link broke. Thael heard a gasp behind him. He waited, eyes fixed forward, face impassive. The reply came, tinged with sorrow barely sensed. "I can save the boy, should you wish it." "I do not know what I wish." "You and your son will both fall at the hands of the other guardians, if the Order learns of this." Bloodlust surged through Thael at the thought. "None of them are foolish enough to try." Do not presume that you are the only guardian who is acquainted with one such as I, Thael Irilam. Several of your rivals have similar acquaintances and are far less scrupulous. Thael clenched his fists. What is to be done? The only thing that can be done. The boy must be shrouded. That could kill him. Yes, it may. But he will surely die when the keepers of the writ seek him out. And seek him out they shall. Him, and then you. Thael severed the link and swore aloud. The bastard was right. The Order would condemn his blood, just as Thael had condemned the blood of every apostate he had encountered. They would strip him of land, title, and station. They would forswear and publicly execute him. They would raze his freehold to the ground and kill every servant within the walls. Then they would find every member of his bloodline, no matter how far removed, and butcher them. Such was their hatred of all marked by Anak the Reviled. It would be fitting, his guest sent. How many bloodlines have you culled? How many indeed? His thoughts drifted to his opulent study with its high shelves of leather-bound books and heavy marble-topped desk. Among the varied tomes and painstakingly illuminated religious texts was a small, nondescript loose-leaf journal. Its simple rawhide covers lacked lettering or title, but its pages were filled with the names of every apostate bloodline he had ever sent to the void. But those names were not only inscribed in the book, they were emblazoned on his soul. He could recite each of them from memory. The thought of that journal swung forth like the iron-shod head of a siege ram. In one fell stroke, it demolished the carefully built wall of false righteousness behind which Thael had hidden the horrifying memories of a life of murder. The blood-choked screams of the thousands he had sent to the void suddenly burst forth as water from a collapsing dam. His composure crumbled as the torrent of bloody memories inundated his mind and instantly drowned his dignity in the freezing waters of regret. He sank to his knees and sobbed aloud as anguish finally overcame him. How had he let it come to this? How had he, a man of honor and principle, allowed himself to be deluded into committing murder? For that was the absolute truth. The Order had bestowed title upon him, had sanctioned his actions fully, had even trained him, but he was no guardian, no protector, no preserver of the faith. He was a murderer, among the foulest of murderers. Oceans of innocent blood stained his hands. He knew that, had always known it. The knowledge of assured damnation had always been there. He had simply buried it under a mountain of carefully twisted Order rhetoric in order to justify the deeds he had allowed himself to perform. Love had not earned him this reward. This night's sorrow was the result of his own mindless, willfully ignorant hate. The revelation left him feeling as empty as the howling void. He had never in his 43 winters felt so small, so far from his goddess. He had sent 1,013 souls to the embrace of Anak in the execution of his duties. Never mind how many were apostate. 1,013 innocent souls. Souls who were guilty of nothing more than drawing breath. Many had never taken their first steps. 2 had never even tasted of their mother's breast. Such acts were surely not those of a man who knew love. Thael knew he could never redeem himself, in his own eyes or those of his goddess. There was no atoning for the sins he had committed. He could not save himself from damnation. But he could save others. He could save the boy, this he knew. But that would not stop others like him from being murdered in the name of a goddess of love. One life mattered little in the grand scheme. The mightiest avalanche starts with a single flake of snow, he thought, and I must start somewhere. He wiped his tears aside. He took several deep breaths, calming himself as best he could. He felt odd, freed. The realization of his own crimes and recognition of his own hubris and ignorance had somehow relieved the worst of his agony. His heart still felt empty, but there was now a faint glimmer of what exactly? Hope? Is this what a criminal feels when he relents and confesses his crimes? Perhaps. He stood, then cast his mind outward. The decision is made. Help me, if you can. The reply was forceful.
There is a price, Thael. You will cease your zealotry and allow us to live in peace.
I expected no less.
There is more. He must be watched. The shroud will not hold forever. When it begins to fail, we must take him.
Thael sighed. There was once a time, only a turn of the glass earlier, when the thought of his own flesh and blood, bastard or not, living as an apostate, would have infuriated him to the point of bloodshed. He lowered his head and saw that he was trembling again. He looked inward to calm himself, and what he saw in his heart was no longer blind rage or even sorrow, but a single incandescent mote of hatred. He was no stranger to hatred. Hatred for the void had driven his blades through the hearts of every apostate he had ever culled, and every criminal he had ever executed. This hatred was different, however. This was not the sudden, short-lived revulsion that allowed him to set aside pity long enough to ignore the pleas of a new mother or the frightened screams of her offspring. Nor was it the barely noticeable subliminal spite that allowed one to justify a life filled with such horrific deeds. This was a slow, calculating, burning variety of hatred that encompassed his mind and soul. It was already changing him as its roots sank into his being, and it was not directed at the void, or the heretic, or the criminal, or even this apostate fiend who now stood behind him. It was focused upon his own Vindran order, the keepers of the writ, the men who had so corrupted its once noble purpose. But most of all, it was focused upon his own sorry, deluded life.
The corruption of the order must be excised, carved out at the root, incinerated. But before you try to change the world, you must first change yourself.
He nodded once. The echoes of his guest's shared thoughts sounded in his mind once more.
We must prepare. I will send an agent to you in the coming days. Take the boy. Go into retreat. Claim you are mourning. Seal your thoughts. We will find you when we are ready.
Thael nodded again. The cold, overpowering presence of his guest faded as he moved away.
I cannot bring myself to thank you.
The man stopped.
I do not expect it.
Then go. The presence vanished. The twin moons found a gap in the clouds and peered down at the world as Thael's mind raced to formulate plans. The family retreat was his grandfather's homestead, far off to the south. Few knew of it, Thael's unwelcome guest among them. He prayed it would suffice. As for the order, well, there were many ways a Sept Thornreaver guardian could thoroughly complicate their lives. His newfound resentment for them gave him all the motivation he needed. All he lacked was a little creativity. He looked up and gave a sardonic laugh. It was ironic, to say the least, that the only hope to save his son's life would condemn him to death should it fail, or a life of intolerable misery should it succeed. He was hard-pressed to decide which was worse. A great, resigned sigh escaped him. He gazed up, past the polished sneers of the gargoyles, his eyes searching the heavens for answers. High above, somewhere beyond the patchwork veil of winter's first clouds, the stars gazed back from their distant cradles, uncaring and unreachable.